Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished participants and panelists, I'm very pleased to be here. 60 years ago, our world was undergoing profound change. Across the globe, there was growing awareness of the pervasive impact of racism. South Africa remained firmly entrenched in apartheid, but at the same time, on the African continent and beyond, states were emerging from the shadow of colonization and people were demanding equality, rights and recognition. In several countries, powerful civil rights movements led the push for racial justice and for international legal measures against racial discrimination. In this period of mobilization, hope, energy and promise, the international community came together to examine one of the most fundamental questions of the time: how to ensure the equality and dignity of all people, no matter their race, color, descent or origin. The result, the International Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Racial Discrimination, was a milestone. It was the first human rights treaty to be adopted after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And today the Convention is one of the most widely ratified human rights treaties in the world, with 182 states parties. Now, 60 years after the Convention was adopted, we remember how far we have come and how hard we have fought for equality, for racial justice, and an end to discrimination. We recall the historic end of apartheid in South Africa. We welcome the adoption of legal frameworks to combat racial discrimination. We acknowledge the development and implementation of national action plans against racism in numerous countries. And we call for more action, solidarity, equality, and racial justice. Excellencies, distinguished participants, despite the significant progress that has been made, the Convention's promise remains unfulfilled for many. And we can never take for granted what we have achieved. We cannot be complacent. Racism and white supremacy continue to poison our communities, politics, media, and online platforms. A wave of dehumanizing narratives is both feeding on and fueling fear and division. And this toxic rhetoric is amplified by social media so that it echoes throughout the online world and seeps into our offline lives. People of African descent, migrants and asylum seekers, Roma, indigenous peoples and others are denied their rights and treated as subhumans simply because of their color, descent, or national or ethnic origin. Marginalized racial and ethnic groups continue to be targeted, excluded and scapegoated all over the world. Structural and institutional racism shackles them to the past and prevents them from thriving in the present or moving into the future. And we see a frightening proliferation of racist violence and hate crimes. Recent studies in Europe have highlighted a worsening trend of racism against people of African descent, as well as ongoing pervasive discrimination against Roma. The poverty rate for indigenous peoples exceeds 40% in multiple countries in Latin America, where structural discrimination holds them back. Excessive use of force and deaths of people of African descent at the hands of law enforcement officials continues in many countries, including Brazil. In the United States, between 2013 and 2023, unarmed black people were almost 4 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. Women belonging to marginalized racial and ethnic groups continue to face intersecting forms of discrimination that deepen their exclusion and isolation. We see stark disparities in access to education, work, health, and low participation in public life and decision-making. For example, in some European countries, black women are 4 times as likely and Asian women twice as likely to die in childbirth than white women. Mr. Vice President, racism attacks the very foundations of our societies, weakening and dividing us and damaging everyone, everywhere. And the solution is clear. We need strong leadership to overcome centuries of discrimination, Societies need to address the terrible legacies of enslavement and colonialism, and that means identifying the truth, defining the harm, and pursuing reparations in its various forms. States must adopt and implement comprehensive anti-discrimination laws and policies, establish and strengthen national human rights institutions and equality bodies, and ensure the meaningful, inclusive, and safe participation of racial and ethnic groups in decision-making. We cannot accept any rollback of hard-won gains. We cannot allow the silencing of voices highlighting systemic racism. And we cannot permit the erasure of the history of enslavement and colonization or the denial of the profound trauma and intergenerational suffering it has caused. The absurd, senseless hatred and simple callousness of racism have been brilliantly exposed and critiqued by artists and writers around the world. The Indian writer Arundhati Roy, for example, has pointed out that racism is a failure of the imagination, demonstrating an inability to see the world in terms other than those set out for you. Poetry also captures the resilience and determination of the victims of racism. I'm thinking of the legend Maya Angelou, who wrote, "But still, like air, I'll rise." And South Africa's national poet laureate Mongane Wally Serote, who said, "There will be a better time." Today, as we commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and as we mark 60 years of the Convention, we listen to these voices that describe something so terrible with such eloquence. We condemn racism in all its forms, and we support its victims everywhere and in every interaction. We resolve to stand up for justice and equality always, to dismantle entrenched power structures and confront white supremacy, to work with affected communities and to challenge the biases in our societies. Racism has been a destructive part of our world for centuries. It is a deeply ingrained practice that is learned and then lived and passed from one generation to the next. We must break this vicious cycle and live up to the Convention's promise. In fact, we must build a world in which racial discrimination is a thing of the past. Thank you.